everyone. I hope you all are having a blessed evening, all with your families and your loved ones during this Shabbat. This week, I have the privilege to be able to go over Parashat Tetzei. And Parashat Tetzei, it covers Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 10, all the way through chapter 25, verse 19. And the section that I'm going to be focusing on, it's the last chapter of verses 17 through 19. And I specifically looked at this because what caught my attention was actually the title of just this section, just these 3 verses. And it says, "Beware, blot out Amalek." So that's kind of like, something that shows like a warning sign, right? You have red lights, beware. You see a red stop sign, right? And it caught my attention. And maybe this is something that we don't really, study a lot, or we know maybe stories from before, or little things here and there. But who is Amalek? Who is Amalek? And when we go into who Amalek is, we see, we always skip, through those chapters, right? That have like the full genealogies of all the names of this was the son of this person, and this was the son of this person, and so on and so forth. But it's always, important to study every single part of the scriptures. We can't take shortcuts, or we can't, try to go, another route. We have to study all the scriptures, all the fullness of the scriptures. And when we look into a little bit into Amalek, we see that his parents, you have Eliphaz, and his mom was Timnah. And we look into Eliphaz was the son of Esau. And we know that, and we've come to learn that the relationship between Esau and Jacob wasn't, at its best, right? Even though there was that time where they came together, and it was a time, of forgiveness, quote unquote, and things like that. But Esau still had that root, in his heart. He still had that hatred in his heart for everything that occurred with the birthright and the stealing or taking of the birthright on Jacob's end. But when we look into Amalek, or when we see the Amalekites, when the people of Israel were leaving the land of Egypt, and as they were going to the promised land, they were actually, they had like a surprise attack from the Amalekites. This was the first nation that came against Israel. And there was, I guess you can say not a specific reason, but technically it's, because they were God's chosen people. And when we look into these verses in verse 17 through 19 in Deuteronomy chapter 25, we notice that there's 2 mitzvah, or 2 mitzvot that are given here. Okay? And when we look at these mitzvot, the first one is mentioned in verse 17, and it says, "Remember what Amalek did, what they did to you along the way as you came out from Egypt." So the first one was to remember what Amalek did. And the second was towards the end of verse 19, and it says that you are to blot out the memory of Amalek from under the heavens. So why would God mention these things? We have to remember what they did, but at the same time, we have to blot out the memory. So I'm meaning, in other words, that Amalek cannot exist from under the heavens. If you remember, when we go back to the story of Saul was commanded by the prophet Samuel that they had to wipe out Amalek. And even though Saul was victorious, quote unquote, right? But he spared the life of the king of the Amalekites. He also spared the flocks as well. So he was in disobedience because he didn't fully blot out the Amalekites as he was supposed to. And when the prophet Samuel found out about his disobedience, he lost his kingship. So disobedience caused him to lose his position. And prior to Samuel killing, because he took it upon himself, since Saul didn't do what he needed to do, then Samuel was going to kill Agag. But prior to him killing Agag, we end up finding out that his wife had a child. So meaning, since Saul disobeyed and didn't do what he had to do, then now the lineage was going to continue going. And as I mentioned, of course, Samuel did end up killing King Agag. And when we go along the generations, as I mentioned, those chapters that we don't like to read, the genealogies, then generations on, or 500 years later, then we have Haman who comes about. And we see the hatred that Haman had towards God's people, towards the Israelites. And we see this of course, in the story of Esther, and this is something that we read and go over during the time of Purim. But during that time, during Esther's time, Haman and his sons were the last of the Amalekites. So we ask ourselves, why in this verse, God is telling us to remember what the Amalekites did and to blot out their memory from under the heavens. And though biologically or physically the Amalekites are not existing today, but the spiritual nation is still remaining on the earth today. So we need to understand, especially now in the times that we are living in, that we are in a spiritual warfare. And this is not something that we can go against in the flesh. We cannot do it in our nephesh. We know, and what the Word of God says, if we go into our Bibles in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 10, I'm going to read 10 through 13, and it says, finally be strong in the Lord, okay? Not be strong in yourself. It says to be strong in the Lord. So meaning we need to remain in the Lord for us to be strong. And in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you are able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the worldly forces of this darkness, and against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the full armor of God so that you may be able to resist when the times are evil. And we are living in evil times. So when the times are evil, and after you have done everything, to stand firm. Okay? So we are to stand firm. And the battle is not against flesh and blood, but it's against all the evil darkness that exists. So we are able to stand firm when we seek the Lord, when we are in the Lord. And how can we do this? We can do this through prayer. We can do this when we remain in his word. We can do this through fasting. We cannot go against a spiritual enemy in the flesh, because you will lose it all, as Saul did. He moved in disobedience. He moved in the physical. He moved in the flesh. He moved in what his eyes saw. And Abba is clear when he gives us instructions on how we should walk and how we should confront the enemy. We need to be in constant prayer, especially for Israel, for the Israelites, for this war that's going on. Because again, the battle is not against flesh and blood. They are literally going against the spirit of Amalek. They are going against the spirit of Amalek because the hatred that they have towards the Jewish people or the land of Israel or all those who are believers in Messiah Yeshua. So we need to constantly be praying for Israel. We need to also be constantly praying for the nations of this world. We need to be in constant prayer for ourselves and our walk in the Lord, because we need to ensure that we are walking in the Spirit and we are not walking in the flesh. Because when we walk in the flesh, meaning that we walk in our own emotions, in our own thoughts, and what we think is correct, we are going to fall. As I mentioned, we're going to fall just the same way that Saul fell. We're going to fall because we are not standing firm. We cannot stand firm in our own mindset. We cannot stand firm in our emotional instability. We can only stand firm when we are in the Lord, when we are remaining in Him. Yeshua is our best example. Many times He separated Himself to pray to His Father. He fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. And when the enemy attempted to tempt Yeshua, he did not succeed because Yeshua spoke the word. And this is why we need to remain in Him. We need to remain in Him because He will remain in us, as His word says. Queen Esther prayed and fasted for 3 days and 3 nights, as her life was at risk to present herself before the king unsummoned. And because of her obedience to the call and moving in the Spirit through prayer and fasting, her life was spared, and so were God's people from the hands of Haman. When we encounter difficulty, and I'll end with this, when we encounter difficulty in our lives, the strongest weapon that we can use is prayer, fasting, and obedience. So we need to keep that in mind. It doesn't matter how old you are, us especially as young adults. We can be an example to the youth. We can be an example to the children. We can even be examples to many adults. Let's ensure that we are walking according to the word, that the best weapons that we can use in this spiritual warfare is prayer, fasting, and obedience to the word of God. May you all be blessed in this evening. Shabbat Shalom.